My name is Vanessa Corbett. I'm 29 years old. 6 years ago, on the morning of my promotion meeting, my father stood in front of my car keys and said, "Your brother needs a haircut before his big date, Vanessa. You're driving him." My mother nodded along, already holding his gel and comb. My brother Tucker sat on the porch scrolling his phone and said, "Relax, it's just a meeting. You can reschedule." They didn't care. I had one shot at a promotion I'd worked 3 years to earn. They wanted me to chauffeur him to the barbershop instead. So I left the keys on the hook, walked to the bus stop and never looked back. For 6 years they thought they'd cost me everything. They were wrong. Now the tables have completely turned, and Tucker is about to find out exactly what that haircut cost him. If this story is already making your blood boil, like and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and the time right now. I read every one. Let me know if you're on Team Vanessa. I need you to understand something about my family before I tell you what happened that morning, because from the outside, we looked completely unremarkable, the kind of family nobody would ever suspect of anything. We lived in a split-level house in Overland Park, Kansas, the kind of neighborhood with identical mailboxes and a homeowners association that cared deeply about lawn height. My father, Russell Corbett, worked as a plant supervisor at a manufacturing facility outside the city. My mother, Sandra, worked part-time at a dental office and spent the rest of her energy managing the household like it was a small business with exactly one favored client. 2 kids, a modest split level, a Buick in the driveway that got traded up the year Tucker turned 16. On paper we were fine. But inside that house there was a hierarchy, and I learned it the way you learn anything you're forced to absorb before you have the words to name it. My brother Tucker was 3 years younger than me, but from the time he could crawl, my parents treated him like something rare and breakable, something requiring constant tending. He was the charming one, the good-looking one, the one relatives cooed over at every holiday gathering while I stood a few feet away, technically present but somehow beside the point. He had this easy, disarming smile that made adults forgive him things they'd never have forgiven me. And my mother built her entire parenting philosophy around protecting that smile at any cost. I was the capable one. That was my designation, delivered with a faint, apologetic undertone, as though capability were a lesser prize handed to the child who hadn't inherited the more valuable gift of being adored on sight. I got good grades without needing to be told twice. I held down a part-time job starting at 15. I never caused problems, which I eventually understood wasn't a virtue in that house so much as a liability, because it meant nobody ever felt the need to check on me. It started small, the way these things always do in families that pride themselves on never raising their voices. Can you cover Tucker's shift at the family friend's hardware store? He's got a thing. Can you drive him to practice? I've got a hair appointment. Can you smooth things over with Dad after he blows off another curfew? Don't make it a bigger deal than it needs to be. By the time I was 17, I was functioning less like Tucker's sister and more like an unpaid buffer between him and the consequences he never seemed to face, while my own life sat quietly on hold in the background. I threw myself into work because it was the one arena where the scales weren't rigged against me from birth. I started as a part-time file clerk at a regional logistics company the summer after high school, worked my way into a full administrative role within 2 years, and by 23 had been promoted into an operations coordinator position that actually used the business degree I'd earned taking night classes while working full-time. I didn't do any of it because I expected my parents to notice. I did it because it was the one part of my life nobody else had a claim on. The promotion I was working toward at 23 wasn't a small thing. It was a shift into a regional operations manager role, a title that came with a real salary increase, a real team to lead, and a final decision meeting scheduled with the regional VP on a Thursday morning in March, the last step before an offer went out. I'd been building toward that meeting for over a year, taking on extra projects nobody else wanted, staying late without being asked, positioning myself as the obvious internal choice long before the opening was ever posted. I'd told my parents about the meeting 3 separate times in the 2 weeks leading up to it, because some instinct told me, correctly as it turned out, that I needed a witness to the fact that they'd known. What I didn't yet understand was that Tucker had a date that same Thursday evening, his first with a girl he was apparently serious about, and that in my family's arithmetic, my one shot at a promotion I'd spent a year earning was about to be weighed against my brother's haircut before a date and lose. I had no idea, sitting at the kitchen table that Thursday morning with my blazer already pressed and my notes already reviewed, that the fight waiting for me in the driveway wasn't going to be a fight at all. It was going to be a decision my parents had already made without me, one they fully expected me to simply accept, the same way I always had. If you've ever had your career treated as negotiable while someone else's date night was treated as sacred, drop the word duties in the comments. I read every single one. And stay with me because what happened in that driveway is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. To understand how deep this went, you have to understand the accounting nobody in my house ever did out loud, the invisible ledger where my time was always worth less than Tucker's convenience. By the time I hit high school, the pattern had calcified into something so routine nobody even questioned it anymore. I was the capable one, which in Corbett family language meant my plans were the ones that could always be rearranged without warning. Tucker was the sensitive one, which meant his wants were treated with an urgency other families reserve for actual emergencies. I remember being 16 and giving up a weekend shift I'd specifically requested off for a friend's birthday because my mother needed me to cover Tucker's babysitting commitment for a neighbor, a commitment he'd simply decided he didn't feel like honoring that particular Saturday. I remember being 17 and missing my own robotics club regional competition because my father needed the car for Tucker's travel baseball tournament, and nobody thought to ask whether there was a version of that day where both things could happen. None of these moments were catastrophic on their own. That's the part people outside a family like mine never quite understand. There's no single incident you can point to and say that's the neglect. It's cumulative. It's 1,000 small decisions cast in the same direction over and over, until the outcome becomes inevitable and nobody has to say it out loud. Tucker's comfort came first and mine got assembled out of whatever was left over. My mother had a phrase she loved. "You're just so steady, Vanessa. Tucker needs more from us right now." She said it like a compliment every single time, like steadiness were a gift instead of a punishment disguised as praise. What she really meant was, you don't complain, so we're going to keep exploiting that. Tucker complained about everything, and every complaint got treated like a crisis requiring immediate intervention. I complained about nothing, and my silence got treated as confirmation that nothing was actually wrong. My father's version was quieter but somehow sharper. He worked with his hands, precise and methodical on the plant floor, vague and evasive about anything involving his children's emotional lives. When I brought home a promotion at my first real job, he said, "Good for you, Nessa," and then spent the rest of dinner explaining to my mother why Tucker's latest fender bender wasn't really his fault, blaming the other driver, the weather, the intersection design, anything except an honest look at the fact that Tucker had been on his phone. I got into a rhythm of managing my own expectations downward so the disappointment would sting less. I stopped announcing good news at the dinner table because announcing it into a room that didn't care felt worse than not saying anything at all. When I got my first real promotion at 21, moving from file clerk into a full administrative role, I mentioned it over text, days after the fact, almost as an afterthought because some part of me had already learned not to expect a reaction that matched the size of the accomplishment. Tucker, for his part, never had to do any of that math. His world was engineered so that wanting something and receiving it were nearly the same motion. When he wanted a car at 17, he got a nicer one than the hand-me-down sedan I'd been handed at the same age. When he dropped out of 2 different community college programs within 18 months because they weren't for him, nobody pushed back and my father simply found him a job through a friend at the plant instead. When he wanted new clothes for a date, my mother handed him cash without a second thought. I built my career entirely on my own. Nobody helped me write a resume. Nobody coached me through an interview. Nobody in that house understood or particularly cared to understand what an operations coordinator actually did or why the regional manager promotion I was chasing mattered as much as it did. When I finally got the email inviting me to the final decision meeting with the regional VP, I read it 3 times alone in my car in the parking lot before I told anyone because I'd learned by 23 not to bring big news into a room until I was sure I could survive the silence that might follow it. When I finally told my parents over dinner, my father said, "That's great, that's a good step," in the same tone he might use to acknowledge a decent weather forecast, then immediately pivoted to asking whether I could take Tucker to get his haircut before his date Thursday since my mother had a dental office shift that ran late. My mother added without missing a beat, "It shouldn't take long. You'll still have plenty of time before your meeting." I spent the 2 weeks leading up to that meeting preparing like it was the only thing standing between me and the future I'd spent 3 years building because in a very real sense it was. I reviewed every project I'd led that year. I rehearsed how I'd answer questions about team management, about budget oversight, about the specific initiatives that had made my case for the role. I picked out my outfit a week in advance, a navy blazer I'd bought specifically for this, the only formal thing I owned that didn't look borrowed from someone else's idea of professionalism. I had no idea that the morning of my meeting, my parents were going to treat the single most important day of my career as an inconvenience to be scheduled around Tucker's haircut instead of the other way around, the same way they'd treated every other important day I'd ever had. The haircut had been on the calendar exactly 6 days by the time my meeting morning arrived, which meant my mother had scheduled it 3 days after I'd already told her, in plain, unambiguous language, that my promotion meeting was set for that exact Thursday morning at 9. I'd shown her the calendar invite myself on my phone, standing in the kitchen watching her eyes move across the screen. She'd nodded, said, "Okay, got it," and then apparently gone right ahead and booked Tucker's haircut appointment anyway. The same Thursday 9:30 at a barbershop across town 20 minutes in the opposite direction of my office. I found out the collision existed 5 days before my meeting on a Saturday night, when Tucker wandered into the kitchen holding his phone like it was breaking news. "Hey, so I booked my cut for Thursday morning before my date with Reagan. Mom said you could drop me since your work thing isn't till 9. I remember the exact sensation of my stomach dropping because my meeting was at 9, not after 9, and I already knew with a sick, familiar certainty exactly how this was going to unfold before anyone had even said a word about logistics. "Tucker, my meeting is at 9. That's not enough time to drive you across town and still make it downtown by then." He shrugged, already scrolling again. "I don't know, man. The appointment's booked. Ricky's the only guy who can fit me in before Saturday." It was not, in fact, an unsolvable problem, and I found that out for certain the next morning when I brought it up directly with my mother over coffee. "Mom, Tucker's haircut is the same morning as my promotion meeting. I need the car that morning, and there's no way I can drop him and still make it downtown by 9. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Ricky books out weeks in advance, Vanessa. We can't just move it. Can't you leave a little earlier?" There's no earlier that makes both things work. My meeting starts at 9. If I drive Tucker first, I'm walking into the biggest meeting of my career 15 minutes late if I make it at all. "Well," she said in that particular tone that meant she'd already stopped listening, "we'll figure something out." We did not figure something out. What actually happened over the following 4 days was a slow, deliberate erosion of every solution I proposed. I suggested Tucker take an Uber, and my mother said that was an unnecessary expense, when we had a perfectly good car sitting in the driveway that I could use before work. I suggested my father drop him on his way to the plant, and he said his shift started too early, the same excuse I noted that never once applied to anything of mine. I suggested Tucker simply move his own appointment to the afternoon since his date wasn't until evening, and he said with a flat, bored finality that told me exactly how seriously he'd considered the question, "Ricky doesn't have anything open in the afternoon." I already checked. By Wednesday night, the day before my meeting, nothing had been resolved, and I understood with total clarity that nothing was going to be resolved, because resolving it would have required my parents to treat my need as equal in weight to Tucker's want, and that equation had never once balanced in my favor in 23 years. I confronted my father directly that night in the living room, The way you confront someone when you've run out of patience for polite negotiation. Dad, I need the car tomorrow morning. This is the actual promotion meeting. This decides whether I get the regional manager job I've been working toward for a year. I need you to tell me right now who's driving Tucker. He set down the remote, and for a second I actually thought he was going to say something that mattered. Instead he said, "Look, Nessa, I know this is a big deal for you, but Tucker's had that appointment booked for a week now. Ricky's hard to get in with. We can't just cancel on a whim." "It's not a whim, Dad. It's my career. There's no version of this where both things happen unless someone else drives him." "You're resourceful," he said, like that settled it, like the sentence itself was an argument rather than simply a restatement of the problem. "You'll figure something out. There'll be other promotions if this doesn't work out." I felt something go cold and very still inside my chest. "There won't be another promotion exactly like this one, Dad. This is the meeting. This is the whole thing." My mother walked in from the kitchen at exactly that moment, drying her hands on a dish towel, and delivered the line I have never once managed to forget in 6 years. "Vanessa, stop making this so complicated. It's one haircut. Tucker's had that appointment booked for a week. We need you to understand that not everything can revolve around you. Not everything can revolve around you." I had spent 23 years revolving around everyone else in that house, and the one morning I needed something to revolve around me even slightly, even for 30 minutes, I was being accused of demanding too much. "This is the same thing you've done my whole life," I said, and my voice cracked on the word life in a way I hated, because I didn't want to sound like I was pleading. "You've never once asked what I needed without weighing it against what Tucker wanted first. And Tucker wins every single time." My father's jaw tightened. "Don't be so dramatic. It's one morning." "It's not one morning. It's the only morning that will ever matter for this specific thing." Nobody had an answer for that. My mother went back to the kitchen. My father picked the remote back up. And I stood there in the middle of that living room, 23 years old, finally understanding with total unclouded clarity exactly where I ranked in my own family's arithmetic. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed running the numbers over and over, the drive time, the meeting time, the fact that my parents hadn't offered a single genuine compromise, hadn't asked Tucker if he actually needed that specific appointment slot, hadn't asked anyone anything. They had simply decided the way they always decided and expected me to bend around the decision the way I always had. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, staring at my ceiling, I made a decision of my own, quietly without telling anyone, one that would take effect in exactly 7 hours and that none of them saw coming, because it had never once occurred to any of them that I might finally stop falling in line. At 7:15 the next morning, I hung my father's spare car key back on the hook by the door, the same key I'd quietly taken off his ring the night before while he was still watching television, walked to the bus stop 3 blocks from our house, and rode 2 transfers into downtown with 40 extra minutes of buffer built into my plan. I didn't leave a note. I didn't announce anything. I had learned over 23 years that arguing with my parents about Tucker never worked, because the argument itself was rigged from the start. So instead of fighting a battle I already knew I'd lose, I simply removed myself from the equation entirely. I made it to the office by 8:20, 40 minutes early, and sat in my car in the parking garage doing the breathing exercises I'd read about the night before, the ones meant to calm you down before something important. My phone, when I finally checked it, had 6 missed calls, 4 from my mother, 2 from my father, and a single text from Tucker that read, "Not cool, Vanessa. Ricky's gonna give my slot away." I didn't respond to any of it. I needed every ounce of composure I had left for what was waiting for me on the 4th floor. The meeting with Diane Marsh, our regional vice president, went better than I'd let myself hope. She walked me through a case scenario about a supply chain bottleneck at one of our satellite warehouses, watched me talk through the logic out loud, pushed back twice just to see how I'd hold my ground under pressure. 45 minutes turned into nearly an hour. At the end, she shook my hand and said, "Honestly, Vanessa, you handled that better than most candidates with twice your tenure. We'll have a decision by end of week." I made it back to my car before I let myself feel anything. Not sadness. Something closer to relief, the strange, disorienting relief of having finally done the one thing I'd never allowed myself to do, choose myself fully with no hedge, no last-minute cave. Then I turned my phone back over and the relief didn't last long. 11 missed calls now. I sat in that parking garage and listened to the voicemails in order. My mother's first, time-stamped 8:40, confused more than angry. Vanessa, where's the car? Tucker's missing his appointment. Call me back. By the fourth, her voice had shifted colder. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is incredibly selfish, even for you. Even for you. I sat with that phrase for a long time. I found out later that Tucker had missed his slot entirely, shown up 20 minutes late after walking most of the way, and Ricky had already moved on to his next client, leaving Tucker to get a rushed, mediocre cut from a different barber before racing home to get ready. According to my mother, he'd been a wreck all afternoon, anxious and short-tempered before his date, and when Reagan picked him up that evening he was apparently still fussing with his hair in the hallway mirror, convinced it looked wrong. I don't say this to be cruel about my brother. I say it because it matters to what happened later. Tucker wasn't incapable. He was, by every account, perfectly able to handle a haircut and a date on his own. But my family had spent years building an entire mythology around the idea that his life required constant management, that without someone smoothing every logistical wrinkle in advance, everything would fall apart. And on the one morning that scaffolding wasn't there, instead of anyone asking why a 20-year-old required that level of coordination before a haircut, they simply blamed me for removing it. I drove home that evening in a car my father had apparently dropped off at my office sometime that afternoon without a word, already knowing exactly what was waiting for me. The kitchen was silent when I walked in, the particular loaded silence of a house that had been arguing about me all day without me present to defend myself. My mother sat at the table, arms crossed, eyes red-rimmed. My father stood by the sink, jaw set. "How was your little meeting?" my mother asked, and the word little did more damage than anything else she said that day. "It went well," I said. "I think I have a real shot at the promotion." "Good for you," my father said in a tone that made it clear it was not, in fact, good for anyone as far as he was concerned. "Must feel nice doing whatever you want whenever you want without thinking about anyone but yourself." "I have spent my entire life thinking about everyone but myself," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. This was one morning out of years where I finally didn't. Nobody had an answer for that. I didn't get an apology that day. I didn't get one that week or that month or really ever, not a real one. What I got instead was a slow, cold freeze, a household that treated me like I'd committed a betrayal simply by existing outside the role they'd assigned me. Tucker barely spoke to me for weeks. My mother's voice took on a permanent edge whenever she addressed me directly. Kept my head down. I went back to work, kept my focus on the job in front of me, and waited to hear back from Diane, half convinced that even the one thing I'd finally done for myself, was somehow going to slip away too. The offer came 4 days later. Regional operations manager, a real salary jump, a team of 11 reporting to me. I told my parents that night at dinner, flatly, without ceremony. My father said, "That's good, Nessa," and went back to his plate. My mother managed a stiff, "Well, I'm glad something good came out of all that." I moved into my own apartment 8 miles away within the month, close enough to feel reachable, far enough to finally breathe. I had no idea that year that a company acquisition 4 years down the road was going to bring my entire family history crashing directly back into my professional life, in a way none of us could have possibly predicted that Thursday morning in the driveway. By 2028, I'd spent 5 years climbing steadily at Holbrook Logistics Group, moving from regional operations manager to senior operations director, and finally at 29, into a position overseeing the entire Midwest division after our company acquired a smaller regional carrier and folded its operations into ours. I was responsible for integrating nearly 60 absorbed employees into our existing structure, building out new supervisory roles, filling gaps left by the transition. Everything from warehouse leads to dispatch coordinators to junior operations analysts. My relationship with my parents by that point had settled into something distant but civil: holiday visits, occasional phone calls, the kind of relationship you maintain out of habit rather than warmth. I'd moved into my own place 5 years earlier and never looked back, building a life that had almost nothing to do with the house I'd grown up in. I saw Tucker even less than I saw my parents. He'd bounced between a handful of jobs after that ill-fated date with Reagan, which hadn't lasted more than a few months anyway, working briefly at an auto parts store, then a stint doing deliveries for a furniture company, none of it sticking longer than a year at a time. Part of my mandate in the acquisition integration was building out an entire dispatch coordination team from the absorbed carrier's local branch, roughly a dozen positions to evaluate and either retain, restructure, or replace over a 90-day window. I wasn't personally screening every file, but as division director, final decisions on anything above entry-level warehouse staff crossed my desk before an offer went out. It was standard procedure, nothing unusual, the same structure I'd have insisted on at any operation I was overseeing. I was reviewing the absorbed dispatch team's personnel files on a Tuesday afternoon in April, mostly delegating first-round evaluations to my HR partner, when a name in the retention review stopped me cold. Tucker J. Corbett. I stared at it for a long moment before I let myself actually open the file, half convinced it had to be some strange coincidence, though I already knew, with the particular sinking certainty you get when the universe decides to be exactly this on the nose, that it wasn't. The file loaded and there he was, unmistakable. Tucker Corbett, hired 18 months earlier as a dispatch coordinator at the carrier we'd just acquired, based out of a branch office roughly 40 minutes from where I now worked. His performance reviews were middling, not disastrous, but not strong either. Notes about missed deadlines on scheduling updates. A couple of complaints logged from drivers about last-minute route changes communicated too late. Nothing catastrophic, but nothing that painted the picture of someone thriving in the role. He hadn't listed me anywhere in his file, obviously, since this wasn't an application he'd submitted knowingly into my hands, but a routine transfer of employment records that happened to land on my desk because of an acquisition neither of us had seen coming. I was almost certain he had no idea I ran this division at all. Our conversations over the past few years had been thin enough holiday small talk mostly, that I'd never once mentioned the specific scope of what I actually did. And I doubted my parents had either, since by that point they'd mostly stopped discussing my career with much detail. I sat with that file open for a long time before I made a decision, and I want to be honest about the two paths in front of me, because I imagine anyone in this position eventually faces the same fork. I could quietly flag the conflict of interest, recuse myself entirely, hand his review to my HR partner, and let the outcome fall wherever it fell without my fingerprints anywhere near it. Or I could let the process run exactly the way it was designed to run for every other absorbed employee, transparently, honestly, without favor and without sabotage in either direction, and simply be present for it. I chose the second option for the same reason I imagine you'd expect by now. This wasn't about revenge. If revenge had been the goal, the easiest path in the world would have been to quietly flag his file for restructuring out and never say a word to anyone about why. What I actually wanted was something closer to the truth laid bare, the chance to see once and for all, without 23 years of built-in favoritism smoothing his path in advance, whether Tucker could actually hold his own in a review process where nobody was tilting the floor for him. I disclosed the family relationship to HR the way policy required, requested a second evaluator sit in for objectivity, documented every step the same way I would for any compliance-sensitive personnel decision. My HR partner, a methodical woman named Renata Voss, reviewed the disclosure and said, "As long as we've got a second reviewer and it's all on paper, there's no issue. Your call whether you want to stay involved in the final conversation." I stayed involved. The performance review itself was conducted jointly, myself and one of my senior operations managers, David Okafor, going through 18 months of dispatch logs, driver feedback and route efficiency metrics. Tucker made it through the initial evaluation without immediate red flags. His numbers were mediocre rather than alarming, and under normal restructuring circumstances that might have been enough to retain him at his current level without much scrutiny. But given the disclosed relationship, per Renata's compliance requirements, any retention decision involving a direct family connection required a formal one-on-one conversation with me present, on record, before any final determination went through. I made that call myself from my direct line, the same number that would have appeared on any other absorbed employee's transition paperwork. He picked up on the second ring. "This is Tucker." "Hi, Tucker. This is Vanessa Corbett calling from Hallbrook Logistics regarding the review of your position following the acquisition." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I could hear him processing it in real time, long enough that I knew the exact moment he understood. "Vanessa? Wait, you work at Hallbrook? Like corporate? Is this a joke?" "It's not a joke," I said, keeping my voice level, the same professional tone I'd use with any other employee going through this transition. "I'd like to schedule a formal review conversation with you and one of my senior managers next Monday at 10 a.m. Would that work?" The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. I didn't fill it. I didn't soften it. I didn't offer him the exit ramp I might have once, back when smoothing his path was simply what I did automatically without ever being asked. "Yeah," he finally said, quieter now, something unfamiliar creeping into his voice that I hadn't heard from him in years. "Yeah, that works." "Great. I'll send the details over email. I'll see you Monday, Tucker." I hung up before he could say anything else and sat there in my office for a long moment, looking out over a division I'd built almost entirely on my own over 5 years of unglamorous, unassisted effort, while somewhere across the city my brother sat with the exact same disorientation I'd once carried alone in a parking garage, finally understanding what it felt like to have his employment depend on a room where nobody, for the first time in his life, was going to tilt the floor in his favor. Monday, April 17, 2028. 9:52 a.m. I sat in the small conference room on the third floor of our Midwest Division office, the same building I'd spent the last several months integrating into a functioning operation, nerves buzzing in a way I hadn't expected, though not for the reasons anyone might assume. Beside me sat David Okafor, brought in as the required second evaluator. Renata sat in as well, mostly as a formality, a quiet observer there to keep the process clean. I'd prepared exactly the way I would for any retained employee's review, same performance data, same structured questions, same format we used across every absorbed staff transition that quarter. I wanted no ambiguity later about whether Tucker had received anything other than a fair, ordinary evaluation. He walked in at 9:58, 2 minutes early, wearing a button-down that looked freshly ironed for the occasion, the kind of effort you put in when you finally understand something matters. He saw me at the head of the table and stopped for half a second in the doorway, long enough that I could see the exact moment his usual ease faltered. "Vanessa," he said, then catching himself, "Sorry, is it supposed to be like Miss Corbett in here?" "Vanessa's fine," I said, gesturing to the chair across from us. "This is David, one of our senior operations managers, and Renata from HR is observing. We're going to walk through your performance metrics from the past 18 months, then talk about what a path forward could look like. Should take about an hour." He sat. He straightened his collar. I watched him try to find his footing in a room where, for the first time in his entire life, none of the usual scaffolding existed, no parent smoothing the path in advance. No older sister quietly managing details so he could simply show up and coast on charm. Nobody in the room whose job it was to make things easy for him. David opened with the dispatch metrics, walking through the missed scheduling deadlines, the driver complaints about last-minute route changes, the pattern of small inconsistencies that had accumulated over a year and a half into something that read on paper as a coordinator who was competent but consistently behind, always reacting rather than planning ahead. Tucker answered honestly enough, though the gaps were obvious even in his own retelling. The deadlines he described as "not a huge deal, drivers adjust." the route changes he framed as last-minute stuff that happens, language that minimized a pattern he clearly hadn't examined closely before sitting in that room. When David asked him directly what systems he used to plan ahead for scheduling conflicts, Tucker's answer stayed surface level, something about just kind of handling it as it comes. And I watched David make a note, the kind of note that told me exactly what conclusion he was forming. Near the end, I asked the question I'd asked every retained employee going through this transition. Tell me about a time in this role you had to manage a setback or a mistake. What did you learn from it? Tucker was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that caught me off guard with how unguarded it was. Honestly, I think it's probably that whole stretch after I missed a haircut appointment a few years back. Sounds stupid, but it kind of messed with my head for a while, showing up late to things, feeling like I couldn't get anywhere on time without someone else handling the logistics for me. I never really figured out how to plan things myself before that. I'm realizing sitting here that I still haven't, not really. The room went still for a second. David made a note. I kept my expression neutral, the same composure I'd built over 5 years of professional practice, but something in my chest tightened at hearing him say it out loud, unprompted, in a room designed to evaluate his competence rather than his self-awareness, the closest thing to an honest reckoning I think Tucker had ever spoken aloud in his entire life. What do you think caused that? I asked because the question demanded a follow-up, and because some part of me genuinely wanted to know if he'd ever actually examined it before this exact moment. He hesitated, glancing briefly at me before looking back at David. I think I always had people around me handling the hard parts. I never really had to figure out planning under pressure by myself. I'm realizing that's a real gap, and it's probably why I keep ending up behind on things here. David wrote something down. I already knew more or less what it said because it matched the same conclusion I'd been forming since the metrics review began. Tucker wasn't performing poorly because he lacked intelligence or capability. He was performing exactly the way 23 years of never once being asked to stand on his own would predict. And for the first time he seemed to actually see it, rather than simply feeling its consequences without understanding their source. The review ended at 11:05. I walked him to the elevator myself, professional, composed, the way I would with any employee. At the doors he turned to me, and for a second the practiced ease dropped away entirely. Vanessa, He stopped, then tried again. Am I about to get fired? I could have softened it. I could have offered him the reassurance our parents always had, the kind that smooths over hard truths instead of letting someone actually sit with them. I didn't. You're not getting fired, I said carefully. But I think you already know your numbers weren't strong. We'll follow up with a formal decision by end of week. He nodded, something unreadable moving across his face, and stepped into the elevator without another word. David and I debriefed that afternoon in my office. His assessment landed on retaining Tucker, but at a restructured level, moving him out of dispatch coordination, which required exactly the kind of independent forward planning he just admitted he struggled with, into a warehouse logistics associate role, more structured task work with clear daily protocols and direct supervision. Renata pulled the file for final sign-off, and per policy, since I was a disclosed family relation, the decision required approval from someone above me, our National Operations VP, a man named Gerald Whitfield based out of the Chicago office. I sent Gerald the full file that evening, my disclosure memo, David's independent assessment, Renata's compliance notes, and a short, neutral summary of my own observations from the room. I didn't advocate for Tucker. I didn't advocate against him. I laid out exactly what the data showed and let it speak for itself. Gerald called me the next morning. The restructure to warehouse logistics associate makes sense given the pattern, he said. Given the disclosed relationship, I'd rather keep the final assignment clean. Have him report to a shift supervisor 2 levels below you rather than anywhere near your direct line. Keeps things appropriate, gives him a real shot at something structured enough for him to actually succeed in. I agreed. It felt like the honest call, not a gift dressed up as generosity, not a punishment dressed up as fairness, just a placement based on what the review had actually revealed. Renata called Tucker that Friday with the restructured offer. Warehouse logistics associate, a modest pay adjustment downward from his previous role, reporting to a shift supervisor within a division that was undeniably mine on an org chart where my name sat 3 tiers above his. He accepted. He started the following Monday. I found out through my mother in a phone call that Sunday that when Tucker had told our parents about the restructuring, my mother's first question hadn't been about the role itself, but about the fact that I ran the entire division. Wait, so you actually work for Vanessa now? Like she's your boss's boss's boss. And according to Tucker, there'd been a long pause on the line after he confirmed it, before my mother finally said quietly in a tone that carried none of its usual certainty, "I don't know how I feel about that." I understand exactly how I feel about it. It's the same feeling I've carried since that Thursday morning 6 years earlier, in a driveway in Overland Park, when 2 parents decided their daughter's promotion meeting was negotiable and their son's haircut wasn't, and never once stopped to consider what that decision might eventually cost either one of their children. Tucker has been at Holbrook for about 8 months now. I see him occasionally in passing. My office and the warehouse floor exist in the same building, entirely different worlds inside it. We nod. Sometimes we talk for a minute about nothing important, a shift change, a delivery running late, the kind of small talk 2 people manage when there's too much unresolved history to say anything real between hallways. His supervisor tells me he's steady on routine tasks, still visibly relieved whenever the structure of the day is clearly laid out for him in advance, still a little lost whenever something requires him to plan more than a few hours ahead on his own. He's not thriving. He's not failing either. He's exactly where his actual habits placed him for the first time in his life, without anyone tilting the floor to make the landing softer. I didn't do this to punish him. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this story as a straightforward revenge arc, and it isn't quite that simple. Tucker didn't build the system that raised him to expect things to simply get handled. Our parents built that system decision by decision, favor by favor, one haircut and one blocked meeting at a time. He grew up inside it the same way I grew up inside the version built for me, and neither of us really chose the shape we were handed. But I also finally refused to keep absorbing the cost of that system so he wouldn't have to feel it. That's the boundary. Not cruelty, just the plain, unremarkable act of letting consequences land where they actually belonged instead of quietly catching them the way I always had. My relationship with my parents has never fully recovered, and I've stopped expecting it to. My mother has brought up that Thursday morning exactly a handful of times in 6 years, always to insist that I'm still somehow holding on to something that happened a long time ago, as though the years of pattern that preceded it and followed it were a single isolated incident rather than the architecture of my entire childhood. My father has said even less about any of it, which somehow feels like the most honest response he's given me: silence, because there isn't a version of the story where he comes out looking like anything other than a man who chose his son's haircut over his daughter's one shot at a promotion she'd spent a year earning. I went to therapy starting about a year after that promotion came through, once I finally had enough distance and enough professional footing to look at my childhood without flinching. My therapist used a phrase early on that I still carry with me: functional invisibility. Not the dramatic kind people picture when they hear about difficult families, not violence, not screaming, just years of consistent, quiet deprioritization, dressed up as practicality, until it became load-bearing in an entire personality. I don't owe my parents access to me just because the neglect never looked like the kind of thing anyone outside the house would have noticed. I built a life that has nothing to do with proving anything to Overland Park. I run a division of over 60 employees now, still growing every quarter. I own my apartment outright, on my own name, my own credit, my own 6 years of unglamorous, unassisted effort. I've been seeing someone for the past year, a man named Owen who has never once asked me to shrink myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger, and who still doesn't fully understand, no matter how many times I explain it, how a family could stand in a driveway and choose a haircut over their daughter's only shot at the future she'd spent a year building. Tucker and I aren't close, but we're not enemies either. Last month he asked, unprompted, if I'd walk him through setting up a simple planning system for his week. No parent relaying the request for him, no charm doing the asking instead of him. I did. I gave him honest, specific feedback, the kind nobody in that house ever gave either of us growing up, and he took it without flinching, which felt in its own small way like the first sign of something different starting to take root. I don't know if my parents will ever understand what that morning cost both of us, not just the meeting, though that mattered plenty, but the entire architecture of two lives built on the assumption that one child's needs were negotiable and the other's were sacred. I've stopped waiting for that understanding to arrive. Some doors close because someone else shuts them, and some close quietly on their own the moment you finally stop holding them open. If you've ever been the child whose career was treated as optional while someone else's convenience was treated as sacred, I hope this story told you something you needed to hear. The tables can turn not through revenge but simply through refusing one ordinary Thursday at a time to keep disappearing so someone else could stay comfortable. Thanks for listening.